Legislative coverage on SDPB is supported by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, SDN Communications, Missouri River Energy Services, Wrench Law, and your membership in the Friends of SDPB. Thank you.
This is a production of SDPB.
"100 legislative sessions from SDPB. Today is Wednesday, January 22nd, and this is In the Moment. Coming up this hour, a State House update and a look at Kristi Noem's transition to Washington, D.C. Lee Strubinger is SDPB's politics and public policy reporter. He joins us first. We'll talk about an action by President Joe Biden in his final hours in office when he granted clemency to Leonard Peltier. Then we will bring in our Dakota political junkies to talk about Kristi Noem's political journey. Plus, we will take a look at 100 imperfect legislative sessions. Bernie Hunhoff and Tony Venheisen are with us. We will explore some of the ways legislators are commemorating the milestone. We are broadcasting today from SDPB's Kirby Family Studio in the city of Sioux Falls. I'm Lori Walsh. You're in the moment, and news is first.
Here's what the governor's proposed budget cut for SDPB means. Less educational support. SDPB provides educational resources for schools, daycare providers, homeschoolers, and parents. We offer professional development for educators, and we fill in the gaps, providing lesson plans and classroom resources for schools. Contact your state legislators and encourage them to restore SDPB's funding. Learn more at sdpbfriends.org/funding. Support comes from Architecture Incorporated in Sioux Falls and Rapid City, providing clients across the region with creative solutions and proven service. Committed to listen, learn, create, and deliver. ArchitectureInc.com.
Guitarist Mike Miller grew up in Sioux Falls, playing music in his father's bands, and went on to play with such renowned musicians as Chick Corea and Boz Scaggs. Miller died last weekend at the age of 71, and this evening on Jazz Nightly, we'll remember Miller with a few of his recordings, along with an interview from 3 years ago. I'm Carl Gerke, and you can join me at 8 Central, 7 Mountain, here on SDPB Radio.
Support comes from the South Dakota Symphony Orchestra. This Saturday in the Washington Pavilion, Delta David Geyer leads Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, plus new American concertos for percussion and violin. More at sdsymphony.org.
Welcome to In the Moment on SDPB. I'm Lori Walsh. In his final hours in office, President Joe Biden commuted the sentence of Leonard Peltier. The decision was celebrated and criticized here at home and internationally. Politics and public policy reporter Lee Strubinger is with us today. We're going to talk about that and much more about the South Dakota State Legislative Session. He is joining us from SDPB's SDN Communications Studio inside the Capitol building in Pierre. Lee, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Lori.
Let's start with what President Biden did. Explain to people who haven't followed this story who Leonard Peltier is and why this is such a controversial commutation of a sentence.
Yeah, so Leonard Peltier is seen by a lot of folks as quite possibly one of the longest-serving political prisoners in United States history. He was involved in a shootout in 1975 on the Pine Ridge Reservation near the town of Ogallala. It was between him and some American Indian Movement activists and 2 FBI agents who were in the area. The incident led to the death of those 2 FBI agents, Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams. And, you know, over the course of the kind of charges around that particular case, 2 of the 3 others who were charged ended up getting those charges dropped. Leonard Peltier had defected to Canada for a little bit, and when he came back, he was sentenced and charged with 2, or he was charged with 2 life, or he ended up receiving 2 life sentences and has been in prison ever since. He's always maintained his innocence. There have been pushes in the past, both when Bill Clinton was leaving office, as well as Barack Obama, to get Leonard Peltier out of jail And in the final waning moments of President Biden's presidency, he issued a clemency for Peltier, who will serve out the remainder of his term on home arrest. But the plan there is that he will go home to the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota and spend the rest of his days there.
And he's 80 years old in failing health, as I understand it.
Yeah, he's diabetic. His health is failing. He's losing his eyesight as well, and so they're hopeful that he'll be able to get better health care through IHS up there in Turtle Mountain.
It's a deeply personal story. Does it also have wide-ranging impact, however? I mean, Joe Biden's not going to run for anything else, so it doesn't necessarily follow him, or does it? What do you see the impact being going forward?
Well, I mean, President Biden, was the first president to have a Native American in his cabinet, or the first one in quite a long time. He also apologized for the role of the United States government when it came to the boarding school initiative. And I think this commutation of Peltier's sentence really sort of is kind of like adds to his legacy when it comes to his role and working with tribes and Native Americans.
All right, lots more to talk about that in the future, but I do want to check in on what's happening in Pierre during this 100th legislative session. As an overview, we're seeing some issues that we saw last year be relitigated in some ways or re-legislated in Pierre this year. Where do you want to begin with some of the topics that where everything old is new again?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of what will probably define at least some of the early weeks of this legislative session, is ideas that kind of went down based on sort of the political leanings and ideology of the particular Republican majority at that time, where some of those ideas and those bills really stalled out. I think we'll see other attempts to kind of bring those back. And where I think it will be interesting is to watch how maybe the kind of coalition of Republicans that aren't necessarily in the full majority, how they vote on some of these issues alongside Democrats or the majority that's in power. I think the ideology is split evenly enough that Democrats will still have a little bit of an outsized influence on some of these particular issues. And so I expect that to really kind of define maybe the first couple weeks that we're here. One of them in particular that is coming up is a bill that would basically require a person to upload their ID online if they're looking to access materials that are deemed as like adult content or internet pornography, those sorts of things. That was something that Republican Representative Bethany Soy brought up last year. It stalled in the Senate. They turned it into a summer study. They looked at it between last session and this session and came up with what it is that they wanted to do. And it wasn't exactly what she wanted to see, because that committee was still kind of comprised of some of the older majority or last year's majority. And so we have a couple competing bills, I guess, on that particular front.
What's the difference, a key difference between those two bills from the House and from the Senate?
Yeah, so the key difference is a phrase called substantial portion. Mm-hmm. What Representative Soy did not include in her particular bill was the idea of a substantial portion. And that's what the summer study really wanted. They wanted to mirror their law after Texas's, which just had a hearing before the state Supreme Court. And basically it says if a website has at least 33 1/3% of its total content created by or hosted or otherwise made available on its website, then it would have to implement this kind of check your ID type thing. And one of Soy's arguments is, well, what if it's 30%? How does that make as much of a difference? Yeah. But the kind of concern with something that Soy is putting out there with the House Bill 1053 that's going to be, as we're recording it, talked about on the House floor today, is whether or not a covered platform that doesn't have that substantial portion language, would that include something like Netflix? Would you have to upload your ID every time you want to watch something on Netflix because it might have material that is considered harmful to minors. So that's kind of the tension between those two bills right now.
Right. So once again, we see the state legislature trying to figure out ways to reasonably protect young South Dakotans from online pornography without running awry of the First Amendment and therefore constitutional trouble. They continue to work on this. Lee Strubinger, thank you so much for the update. We'll let you get to it today, and we'll talk to you next time.
Yeah, you bet. Talk to you later.
We're going to have more analysis here on In the Moment after the break. You are on viewer-supported SDPB.
On the next Fresh Air, Pamela Anderson. She became a pop culture phenomenon in the late 80s, in part because of her role on the series Baywatch. But there's much more to her than that. She received Golden Globe and Screen Actors Guild Award nominations for her role in the new film The Last Showgirl. A documentary about her was nominated for an Emmy. Join us.
Listen Wednesday afternoon at 2 Central, 1 Mountain on SDPB.
Support for Dakota Life, Greetings from Elk Point, is provided by Thermobond Buildings in Elk Point, customizing equipment shelters and mission-critical buildings since 1987. Watch Dakota Life, Greetings from Elk Point, this month on SDPB.
In the years since South Dakota's last legislative session, policymakers and advocates have gathered the data and boiled down some suggestions to make childcare more accessible and more affordable. There's just one problem.
All this really comes down to money. And so if we don't have the money available, this is going to be very tough to do.
The ongoing work to improve access to childcare. That's Thursday, January 23rd at 8 p.m. Central, 7 Mountain on SDPB TV.
Support for South Dakota Focus comes from Sanford Children's, healthcare designed for kids. This month, South Dakota Focus revisits the child care crisis and potential solutions in our state. Thursday, January 23rd on SDPB TV. Politics and Public Policy reporting is supported by the Center for Western Studies at Augustana University.
Welcome back to In the Moment on SDPB. I'm Lori Walsh. Kristi Noem has been in Washington, D.C. lately. She was there for her confirmation hearing last week as Secretary of Homeland Security and also was there for the swearing in of President Donald Trump. So let's check in with our Dakota political junkies for the day for analysis of that and anything else that might be on their minds as they look ahead to this 100th legislative session in Pierre. Seth Tupper is Editor-in-Chief of South Dakota Searchlight, and he is joining us from SDPB's Black Hills Surgical Hospital studio in Rapid City. Hey, Seth.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And Jonathan Ellis, co-founder of the Dakota Scout. We are connecting with him in SDPB's SDN Communications studio in the Capitol building in Pierre. Jonathan, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lori.
Seth, I was looking over the story that you had in South Dakota Searchlight, kind of bringing people up to speed on Governor Kristi Noem's career highlights, her political career highlights, sort of her origin story, and then all the way up to her confirmation hearing and the challenges ahead. One of the themes that you found, and I'd like you to start here, is she has always been a risk taker.
Yeah, and that story is written in part for our other state outlets and maybe people around the country that aren't as familiar with Kristi Noem as we are here. But yeah, just kind of provided an overview of her life and times, and I took that cue on that theme from one of her books where she said herself that her life has been all about risks, and really it seems like since her father tragically died in a farm accident in 1994. She had made a decision after that time to take big leaps and take big risks and go big. And that drove her to run for the legislature, to run for Congress, to run for governor, and now to have apparently told President Donald Trump that the position that she wanted in his administration was Department of Homeland Security Secretary. And according to her, that's what she said, and that's the one she's about to get, apparently. And, the other big risk, of course, is maybe the biggest one, was tying herself and her fortunes to President Trump, which seems to have paid off for now. But as we've seen, that doesn't always pay off in the long run for everybody who gets close to Trump and Trump world.
Yeah. All right. So a few things that stand out to you about her biography and the things that we have seen in South Dakota that you think she might bring with her as Secretary of Homeland Security.
Well, toughness. I mean, I've been as critical of Governor Noem in the commentary I've written for South Dakota Searchlight as anybody, but I definitely recognize that this is somebody who is a substantial person that has a lot of toughness, from being raised on a farm and ranch in South Dakota, and from taking on all the risk and the big political races that she's taken on. So, I think that she's also somebody who's used to maybe being underestimated, somebody who came on the scene as a political newcomer and was underestimated then, but yet, toppled an incumbent to win her seat in Congress, and has been sort of exceeding those early expectations ever since. So I think she'll bring a toughness, and I think she'll bring that ability to take advantage of people underestimating her and use that to her advantage in her own advancement. And I'll be really interested to see how she interacts with the other folks on Trump's team who are dealing with immigration. Tom Homan, the border czar, and Stephen Miller, who's an advisor to Trump, and they have some immigration responsibilities, obviously that they have, but then we have Noem, who's supposed to be the head of the entire Department of Homeland Security. So it'd be really interesting to see how those personalities, work or clash, because I don't think Governor Noem is somebody who's just going to, stand in the background and let somebody else do the job she's supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Jonathan Ellis, you also have spent more than a few years following the career and the political rise of Kristi Noem. Tell us a little bit of the things that you think her political resume brings to this next role as Secretary of Homeland Security.
Well, to go on what Seth said, I mean, big risks, and that congressional run in 2010 was a huge gamble. She's a two-term lawmaker at the time, hardly a household name. There were already two pretty well-established Republicans in the race, including Chris Nelson, who had won statewide office a couple times already, and the specter of Chantel Krebs, who was a much better well-known lawmaker, of also getting into the race. So the fact that she did that in that 2010 primary, wins the primary, and then wins in a general election for a very good year for Republicans. But who would have thought? I think Stephanie Hearst Sandlin had won upwards, probably north of 60% of the vote in 2008 in her couple of her two previous elections. So she has some experience via Congress. That would certainly acquaint her with a lot of these issues that she would be dealing with at the Department of Homeland Security. It's important to remember that this is a huge organization with massive responsibilities. A lot of Republicans, when it was created, and of the Ron Paul variety, were warning at the time that this department was created, that it's too big and it's got too many responsibilities, and it's just going to be too difficult for one person to kind of oversee this as a secretary. So I think she's got her challenges, and I think we've talked about this before, but I think that with all of the unknown people who've come into the country in the last 4 years, I think she's got some real big challenges, whoever is in that position going forward.
Well, Jonathan, I want to go there because the President Trump's inaugural address, he made some statements that were very sweeping about what was possible on the southern border. We're going to stop this. There will be no more border crossings that are not authorized. And some of that seems like a huge challenge to put before the person who is in charge of executing that policy. How will she be judged and measured? How good is good enough at that point? How fast is fast enough to see the president's policies go forth? Because he suggested how much authority she does have to make some of those decisions. She doesn't have absolute authority to do whatever you want in American politics. Can she even do what he's putting in front of her based on the inaugural address?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite a tall order to ask for all illegal entries to stop. I mean, given the size of the border, the terrain of the border, and the fact that there's always been some level of that type of migration back and forth, frankly. And that's a big deal. But some of the legal analysis I've been looking at this morning and listening to on my way to Pier was that some of these executive orders that the president signed last night, it's not just going to be the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, declaring an emergency at the border enables the military to come in and start helping build the wall, things of that nature. So it's not going to be her on an island. I think this is kind of all all hands-on effort. That you've seen Texas now step up its efforts in the last 24 hours. So, this is going to be, I think, a team sport for the Trump administration.
Seth, border crossings, illegal boarding crossings have been down during the final months of the Biden presidency. President Trump put forth some big challenges for the future. How do you think Kristi Noem will be measured as Secretary of Homeland Security? How much scrutiny for immediate action will be on her?
Well, I think there'll be intense scrutiny, not only from the public and millions of people who voted for President Trump and expect, some action on the border, but also from President Trump himself. And when I spoke earlier about, sort of the risk of attaching yourself to the fortunes of President Trump, she's in the good graces now and she's got the job. But, if things go wrong and things don't go well with trying to take action on the border, Trump might be looking for heads to roll, and he might turn to her as the first person to blame, and she could be on the outs with Trump world just as much as she's as quickly as she was in, and so that's the risk that she's taking. So I think she's under pretty intense pressure, and of course there'll be if they do a good job securing the border, there'll be all kinds of people clamoring for the credit, including her. And if things don't go well, there'll be all kinds of people available to take the blame if Trump wants to distribute that.
Yeah. Seth, she said during her confirmation hearing that she was surprised that she didn't get more questions about TSA, which indicated to me that maybe she had some ideas or she was perhaps prepared to talk about TSA more. That's another one of her roles. Natural disasters, she mentioned a lot in her final State of the State address. And of course, we know what's happening in California. They mentioned, President Trump mentioned South Carolina and hurricanes. So she also has to deal with disaster response in her role. And Seth, you've been critical, and we've talked a lot about her disaster response in South Dakota and some of her failures in that regard. Is she ready for FEMA?
Yeah, that was one of the interesting parts of Governor Noem's confirmation hearing, I thought, where she talked about some FEMA employees not coming into work and working remotely, and she was very critical of that. And she said something to the effect of people not even showing up for disasters, which I thought was a highly ironic statement, given the amount of attention and criticism she's received for the fact that on June 23rd, when there were floodwaters bearing down on McCook Lake, she showed up and gave a press conference, made it look as though she was taking charge of everything and running the response. And then, unbeknownst to everybody until a little bit later, when we found out, she flew out to a political fundraiser in Tennessee that night. So that was interesting. That's, of course, one example. But I thought the hearing, even more broadly, was really interesting because just sort of the absurd theater that it is when you think about it. This is the governor of South Dakota, and obviously she spent probably a couple months prepping for this and did a good job. But this is somebody who probably 3 months ago knew almost nothing about the Department of Homeland Security. Probably, she's been to the border and she sent troops there, et cetera. But she was running the state of South Dakota, and I just find it funny, these hearings. They pluck people out of these positions and place them in this chair, and then she kind of crams for a test and sits there and answers all these questions that 2 months ago she probably didn't know anything about. And that's the system we've got, but I just found that to be sort of a funny aspect of the process.
Yeah, they would have prepped her. They would have had mock interviews, and we don't know what the behind the scenes process is. Jonathan Ellis, anything else you want to say about the inauguration, particularly Kristi Noem's role in it and what we're looking for in her first 100 days?
Well, I mean, she obviously during the ceremony itself, I mean, she was pretty central. I mean, you could see her in the shots because of where she was seated in the aisleway there. So I think she had a kind of a prominent seat, a somewhat prominent seat at the event itself. I unfortunately had a lot of work to do yesterday, so I didn't get to see as much as I'd wanted to. But I mean, the inauguration, from what I did see, was it looked like the pomp and circumstance. It looked like a very nice event, frankly. I mean, most people were dressed very well. It just, from a fashion point of view, it looked really good for the most part. And it just looked like a nice event. This is kind of a celebration of our democratic transfer of powers. Going forward, I think this is going to be this next 30 days, next 60 to 90 days what they can get done in terms of putting together a reconciliation package that includes what Republicans want in terms of border and taxes. Those will be big days coming ahead. When will Kristi Noem be confirmed? I mean, she was voted out of Homeland Security last night by a 13-2 vote, just 2 Democrats voting against her in the committee hearing. So I expect she'll actually get some Democratic votes on the floor. Yeah. So, we'll see. I think that will come potentially even by the end of the week.
Yeah, just for clarity, that vote happened Monday night. Yes. All right, Jonathan Ellis, you're in Pierre. Let's wrap up with some of the things that you have your eyes out for this week in the state legislature.
Well, they're just kind of getting going here. There's a bill that the House will have today that would require that certified teachers take some education in Native American studies, which I think is, given South Dakota, that's definitely an important deal. So that's something. But the big issues are have yet to sort of play out yet, but they certainly will be coming.
Seth Tupper, final word, something you're looking for this week in the state legislative session?
We had our reporter Mackenzie Huber was in the Appropriations Committee this morning, where they had presentations from the Department of Social Services and Department of Human Services, and as your listeners may recall, those departments are subjected to a combined tens of millions of dollars in cuts proposed by the governor. So, really interested to hear what came out of that hearing and what the discussion was and how those cuts are viewed going forward.
All right. Seth Tupper is editor-in-chief of South Dakota Searchlight, SouthDakotaSearchlight.com. Jonathan Ellis is co-founder of the Dakota Scout, DakotaScout.com as well. And you can find all of our Dakota Political Junkies content on our podcast. Find it wherever you get your podcast, your favorite platform, SDPB's Dakota Political Junkies. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Lori.
Up next, we will get 2 history lessons on the 100th legislative session. You're in the moment on SDPB.
Comedian Julio Torres had the year of his life with the hit film Problemista and a new TV show, Phantasmus, to his name. But he's never stopped being, well, Julio.
I just got my lab results back, and just as every doctor suspected, I'm simply too much.
The surreal Technicolor comedy of Julio Torres. That's next time on 1A.
Listen Wednesday morning at 10 Central, 9 Mountain on SDPB.
Support comes from the Center for Western Studies, seeking presentation proposals on homesteading and immigration to the Northern Plains for the Dakota Conference. Proposals due by February 21st. More at augie.edu/Dakota Conference.
SDPB has education resources for parents and teachers. Go to sdpb.org/learn. Whether you're getting a child ready for kindergarten or need dissection videos for middle schoolers, we have media and lesson plans for learners of all ages. That's sdpb.org/learn.
Program funding is provided by the South Dakota Hall of Fame, congratulating 2024 inductee Jeff Hazard of Sioux Falls, a thoughtful community builder. More about Jeff Hazard at sdhalloffame.org.
Welcome back to In the Moment on SDPB. I'm Lori Walsh. Legislators from across the state are gathered in Pierre for the 100th legislative session. Celebrations and historical displays commemorate this milestone. Let's take a look at some of that history. South Dakota Magazine editor and publisher Bernie Hunhoff is also a former District 18 senator and representative, and he joined me here in SDPB's Kirby Family Studio to talk about his article, 100 Imperfect Sessions. It's featured in the February issue of South Dakota Magazine. Tell us a little bit about the editorial planning process and why that was important to highlight for the people of South Dakota.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story for us because we haven't always delved deeply into politics, even though in my own personal life it's been a mix of journalism and politics. Yeah. So this is one time when the two have kind of come together. And I did spend, I would guess some readers, especially readers from out of state, may not even know that I did spend 14 years in the legislature and was pretty heavily involved in government for a lot of years, along with being publisher of South Dakota Magazine. And the two were usually kept pretty far apart. This issue, that changes. We've devoted a good share of the issue to our state legislature because this year, 2025, is the 100th session of the legislature. And I just really strongly believe that the legislature in South Dakota is an institution that is really, unlike a lot of institutions that are really failing, I think, rural America, the state legislature honestly just gets better and better. And I don't mean they're making better and better votes every year. I might disagree on that part in the last couple of years. But I mean, as an institution, it's more and more being responsive to the people and reflecting the people. And I think welcoming everyone, welcoming diverse views, some views we may not even agree with, but welcoming and respecting everyone. And I think over the 100 sessions, it's just gotten better and better.
Yeah.
And that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Did you have a sense when you first became a freshman lawmaker that there was a sense of history? Think back to, so what years were you in Pierre?
Yeah, so I was elected in 1992, served 6 years, and then I was out for 10 years and came back in 2008 and served 8 years, so 14 years altogether.
All right. Was there a sense of history when you first walked in the door that they wanted to make sure that you understood, the shoulders that you stood on, for example? No, really not. And when I went in 1993, my first session, it was a very different place than it is today. Term limits hadn't really taken effect yet, and we had what we called the old lions of the legislature. Mostly men, legislators who had been around for sometimes for decades, and had amassed a lot of power and had been committee chairs year after year after year, and just really knew the system, provided great leadership, kind of shut other people out from leadership. There were pros and cons, but no, none of them really spoke to the history of it. The building speaks to the history of it, obviously the architecture, but I would say that no, I don't know if everybody was so busy. We can talk about that. It's such a pace out there that you don't really have time to reflect and think about, how does this relate to history? Yeah. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. My friend Mike Stevens, a legislator now from Yankton, likes to say it's like drinking out of a fire hose. You don't really have time to look at the long-range picture, which is a weakness of the legislature. You're just busy every day for 40 days. It's like a marathon session for 40 days, and you're gone back to your regular life. Yeah. All right, so talk about the building a little bit, some of the things that are special about it. And the building itself is a lot of people know, it's actually a copy of the Montana state capitol, because in traditional South Dakota ways, we were too cheap to go hire our own architect, and Montana had just built a state capitol, and we knew that they had architectural drawings, so somebody from Pierre went to Montana and cut a deal and got their drawings, so it's almost a twin building to Montana's, although we've made some additions through the years that have changed it slightly. But so I think right off the bat, I mean, it just speaks to our conservative, values, and it's a beautiful building, and so much has happened there. To me, that building is the entryway to government for so many people. Government gets a bad rap today. Thomas Paine, one of our founding fathers, said government is a necessary evil. He said society is a blessing. And to me, I've always thought the legislature is kind of like society's entry into government, if it's done right. Yeah. And I do think, again, we do it right in South Dakota. I think we try to make it as accessible as we can, and we've improved on that all through the decades. So that's the part of the history I like to follow, is how we've just gotten better and better and better. If every institution in America did that, we'd be in a lot better place. Is it because we have asked more and more and more of our lawmakers? Because all the lawmakers because they're citizen legislators who are constantly going back home to the farm, to the magazine publishing office, to the doctor's office or the law office where they come from? Or is it because the people of South Dakota are just that engaged? What makes it continue to improve in that connectivity way? No, I think that is exactly, and I think you said it the same both ways. That's exactly what it is. The legislature
in South Dakota is a reflection of the people and of our society because it is so part-time. It is truly a citizen legislature. Yeah, other states, and I'm not an expert on all 50 states, but I've been in a lot of other state capitals and around a lot of legislators from other parts of the country. And they'd like to say that they're citizen legislators, but nothing like South Dakota, where we really truly send folks out there, for 40 days in January and February to just do a marathon session. I mean, it's in Washington, they're proud of themselves if they take a vote every couple of weeks, and in Pierre, it's just it's just bang, 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 bang. You write your own bills, and in between you take votes and look for sponsors and do your research, and we pay them not a lot, very, very much a part-time salary, and we don't buy our legislators a cell phone. We don't buy them any postage stamps. We don't give them any travel other than directly back and forth to Pierre. It's truly a citizen legislature, and we don't give them any staff other than a shared staff in the Legislative Research Council, which is a shared staff. Is not the same as giving you your own personal staff. So there's no barriers between the legislators and the public at all. All through the year, accessibility to legislators is really easy. I've been to other state capitals where you'd be hard-pressed to go into a state capital and find a legislator to talk to. In Pierre, no problem at all. I mean, you can walk in any day during the session, and you'd easily be able to talk to but just about any legislator you want to, I would say, except some of the leaders who might be too busy. It's the accessibility is amazing, and then as technology has changed through the years, it's become better and better, and the legislature has embraced that technology and it's made them more accessible. It's made the committee meetings more accessible, thanks to public broadcasting. In part, you can follow proceedings live in person. Yeah. You can contribute. You can do teleconference in, and you can participate in person from anywhere in the state or anywhere in the country, for that matter. And at times, legislators have balked a little bit at the technology and the accessibility. I was at a meeting once where some pretty respectable legislators didn't know if they really wanted us to tape and record these committee meetings because they weren't sure that they wanted those discussions out there for posterity. They're okay with people showing up and listening, but they weren't sure that they wanted those taped for posterity. Maybe it might stifle the debate, they thought. Right. But overall, even on that particular occasion, we voted to open up the meetings and to record them for posterity. Overall, we've constantly sought more accessibility and offered more accessibility to the public, and that's been a really good thing.
How did it impact you and then your hometown, in the grocery store, at a high school basketball game, at work?
The interesting thing about that is that even today, I've been gone now for 8 years, going on 10 years, and people still ask me, why aren't you in Pierre? and I've never been to Washington, but people still sometimes will say, why aren't you in Washington? I mean, the average Joe Blow out there doesn't follow it very closely. There's a small group in every town and in every county that follows it pretty closely, but most folks don't. They think I'm still out there, or they wonder why I'm not there in July when the session ended in March. So they don't follow it all that closely. But they know you, but they do kind of know you're their legislator, and you're their door to government, and that's an important thing.
Yeah. So you mentioned pre-term limits and the kind of institutional knowledge and wisdom and experience, but then also the the collection of power in certain corners of the state or with certain people. How did you see that change over time then?
Yeah, and because of the way we wrote term limits in South Dakota, where you can go from Senate to the House and back to the Senate, we still have some long-term legislators, and I think it's worked okay. There are pluses and minuses, again, like everything, and we don't necessarily have the a large group of legislators who just come back year after year after year for 20, 25, 30 years. We're seeing less of that, but I'm not so sure that's so much a result of term limits as it's just a result of society's changes. People are just more transient these days in their occupations and in their personal lives. So I think that's maybe had as much effect as that as term limits. Where it's really hurt, I think, somewhat is when you have to jump from house to house to stay in. then you kind of start over on leadership somewhat. So you don't have the same committee chairs, for decades, and that's probably a good thing. It's probably good to switch that up a little bit and to share the power a little more. I think it's good to have some institutional knowledge out there, to have some long-term legislators. I think it's maybe quite all right if you kind of shake up the leadership a little bit once in a while.
Yeah. How does power work in Pierre? And by that I mean, how do you get things done?
Mm-hmm. Well, some people would say it doesn't work, and then as we talked about in the article in the magazine, in some ways maybe that's one of its strengths. It takes a long time for a big idea to take root and to go somewhere in South Dakota. It doesn't happen overnight. I was on a show with Terry Wooster the other day, who was one of the really wise senior journalists and also one of the people who really followed the legislature for decades and decades. And he made a really interesting comment that he said the pattern of the South Dakota legislature is that we go week after week, maybe session after session, decade after decade, with not much happening, and then all of a sudden something really big will just bang happen. Of course, it didn't really happen that way. Somebody planted a seed, and it took a long time for that idea to get out around the state and for people to really think about it, for legislators to think about it, for the right time to come along where the funding was available. A good example would be need-based scholarships. We fought for years for need-based scholarships for our university and tech school students in South Dakota. We were the only state in the nation that did not have a need-based scholarship program. We just fought and fought and fought in Pierre and offered all kinds of ideas, and sometimes we would pass a bill with no money in it. Just to say we have a program and then we'll find the money later, things like that. I mean, it was just very frustrating for years and years. In 2021, with some COVID money and everything kind of came together and there was a little excess money and all of a sudden legislators just passed it with hardly any attention whatsoever.
Yeah.
I could think of numerous situations like that where ideas that had just kind of percolated and laid in somebody's desk drawer for a long time, all of a sudden everything was right. And it's not necessarily that there was a philosophical change. It's just that everything just kind of aligned all of a sudden, and maybe the opposition disappeared for a short time, or they were busy with something else, and something will pass. And that's been a really interesting pattern that frustrating at times for some legislators who want change to happen a little quicker, but maybe it's the South Dakota way, and it served us okay.
You have a wonderful metaphor in the piece in South Dakota Magazine about how the architects who built it made it a bit imperfect intentionally. Tell me about that as a metaphor for how the state legislature works in the first place.
Yeah, one of the old legislators, when I first went to Pierre in 1993, I forget, one of the old legislators took me and showed me a spindle at the top of the third floor stairway. The third floor is the legislative floor, and right at the top of the stairway, about 2 spindles down, as you're going up on the right side, one of the spindles was flipped upside down. And it was explained to me that was done intentionally by the Italian artisans who came to work to do the marble in the Capitol. And their idea was they were very religious, and their point was that we're building this beautiful building, almost a heavenly building. But we're not perfect. We're just men. Only God is perfect, and we're going to flip that around as a nod to God that we're not perfect. And I've always loved that, and I do think it's a metaphor for the way the legislature works. It's not perfect. I mean, in any given day, it can be really frustrating, and people who lack the patience or the long-term vision, and just think it's all about winning at any cost. Those people get pretty frustrated out there. The process isn't perfect, but somehow, as Terry Wooster suggested, somehow it really does work for South Dakota, and it fits South Dakota. It's imperfect, but it works for us. There's a saying that has come along in the last few years in the legislature: if you have a bill, people nitpick your bills, and there's been a pretty common saying now that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Yeah. My bill is not perfect, but it's good, and that is true of the legislature as a whole. It's not perfect, and you can find plenty of fault with it, but it's served us pretty well. And again, as I said earlier, it keeps getting better, more open, more accessible, and that's a really good thing. And I wish we could say the same about all institutions.
That is South Dakota Magazine editor Bernie Hunhoff, and you can read the full article in the January-February issue of South Dakota Magazine. We continue our look into a century of legislative sessions and a century of South Dakota politics. Up next, Representative Tony Venhuizen. He's a Republican representing District 13, and he also runs the Sodak Governor's blog. He joined me here in SDPB's Kirby Family Studio for an update.
Yeah, one thing that worked out, we were fortunate. The State History Museum at the Cultural Heritage Center in Pierre is closed right now for a major renovation. And so our museum staff, in a way, I'm sure they have work to do, but they're in some ways looking for things to do because the museum they run is closed. And so Ben Jones, our state historian, really stepped up with that group and put together, I think it's going to be 10 museum quality exhibits, cases, that will be on the first floor of the state capitol so that when visitors come, they can see, you know, the pen that signed the first state budget and some the gavel and old campaign flyers and just various things from the state collection about the history of the legislature.
Some artifacts and
yes.
context.
Pictures.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then a reunion.
Yes.
Let's get together in April.
Yes. April 12th, which is a Saturday, in Pierre at the Ramkota Convention Center there. We'll be having an all-legislative reunion. As best we can tell, this is the first time that the legislature has organized an all-legislative reunion. We've had excellent registration so far. I think there's going to already at least 300 people have signed up, and I'm sure there'll be more. So there will be, I mean, there was a guy who wrote me a letter. He'd seen it in the news somewhere. He served one term in the legislature, and I think it was 1967 and 68, just one term, wrote me a handwritten letter that he wanted to come to the reunion and wanted to make sure that he knew about it. And so when we got the details set, I sent him a letter back to make sure he would know how to do it. So we'll have, hopefully he can make it, we'll have legislators from back to the 1960s all the way up to the current day.
What are you hearing that's important to them to have that opportunity to get together?
Well, you know, the Historical Society did a panel the other night that I participated in with Terry Wooster and Bernie Hunhoff were the other panelists. And Bernie said something that's really true, that when you've been in the legislature and once you've been out for a few years, you know, a lot of the issues you worked on, the bills you worked on kind of fade into the background. Some of them were important, certainly, but what you really carry with you are the people you met and you know, the old cliche, it's the friends we met along the way, right? Yeah. But that's really true. And I think a lot of people are looking forward to just seeing old friends, seeing people that they serve with in the legislature that they don't get to see as often now. So.
Yeah. Inviting people to come from across the state to visit, especially school children,
yes,
and ways to facilitate that. Tell me that story. That's
right. And Senator Wheeler really spearheaded this aspect of this. We raised a little money. We want to encourage, there are always school groups who come visit the Capitol. Very often they're high school government classes. And they come and take a tour and go to watch some of our meetings, and that's very good. We want to encourage more of that. We also like to see more grade school kids. The Madison fourth grade class has come to Pierre to visit the Capitol for as long as anyone can remember. I don't know how that started, but it's neat to have younger kids there too. And so we'll have a little money available to help underwrite that travel cost. Not a lot, but a little money for the busing. We'll have these historical displays, which are new this year. And also our legislative staff has actually brought back a retired legislative staffer named Doug Decker, who's going to coordinate these tours and give them and put a little more of a organized professional spin on this so that it's more structured when the schools visit.
Yeah. What do we know about you know, the people who have served in the South Dakota State Legislature and where their biographies are available, how we remember them, how we search for them for students who are doing research projects or people trying to come up with that history, and how is that going to change with this session?
Yeah, that's another project we're working on over this next year. Right now on the legislature's website, there's what's called the historical listing, which is a pretty bare bones, just the facts. You can see a legislator's name, what town they were from, what their party was, what years they served. In most cases, when they were born and when they died, assuming we have that information. Not a lot else. What we're going to do, though, is every 2 years there is a printed legislative guide called the Blue Book that includes a picture of every legislator and more detailed biographical information. And the state library has all of those, going back to, I think, the beginning of the state. Well, what we're going to do is scan all of those and then make them searchable by the legislator. So if you search for Tony Venhuizen, you'll be able to see my entry in the, I'm in my second term, so I would have 2 entries. But if you search Bernie Hunhoff, you'll see 7 entries. And then it'll be, maybe over time we can make that word searchable and improve it more. But this will be a quick way to find a lot more information about former legislators than has been available.
What's the time frame for that?
It should be done this year sometime.
Okay.
Probably not till after session.
And that work's coming through the South Dakota State Library.
Yeah, we're partnering with the legislative staff, yeah.
And a book as well, Historical Society
Yes.
Press.
Yeah, another one I'm excited about. We have a great Historical Society Press, and they put out South Dakota History, which is a quarterly journal that's very good. And even before that was founded, I think in the 70s, there used to be an annual compendium of historical articles going back decades. So our Historical Society has a lot of historical articles that have been written about South Dakota, and quite a few that have been written about state politics, about the legislature, about some issue or other. So the state historian, Ben Jones, went through all those and selected, I think, 10 or 12 of them. I may have given him a thought or two, to compile into book form. And then in addition to those older articles, Terry Wooster, who I mentioned, is going to be writing an introduction. He was a reporter for 40 of the 100 legislative sessions, and then worked for the state as a PIO for 5, and so he's personally witnessed almost half of them. Bernie Hunhoff has a great article in South Dakota Magazine that he's also agreed to include in the book. So it'll really be the first time that a book's been published focusing on the history of the state legislature.
And a little poetry?
Bernie also wrote it was funny, at one of our meetings, he was suggesting that we should commission a poem or some kind of a writing to kind of capture the spirit of the citizen legislature. We're part-time, we meet short, and was saying, maybe we could have a contest or maybe some different things. And I was the chairman of this committee. I said, well, I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I think we've already found the winner of the contest. I mean, we have one of the state's best writers sitting right here, and he seems to already know what it should say. And so we assigned Bernie with writing that, and I don't know if it'll be included in the book. It should be, but he has we're having it written in calligraphy on about a 3-foot by 4-foot display, 2 of them. And so there'll be one in the Senate lobby and one in the House lobby. And I think that'll be done even during session. That sounded like that should be done in a month or so.
Yeah. Will there be anything throughout the session that people can turn to again and again? How will these legislators take their place in history and have an awareness of that throughout the session?
There'll be a lot of little things. We commissioned a logo for the 100th session, and most of the printed materials that we have during session that would normally have the state legislature's logo or the state seal, instead we'll have the 100th session logo. The little rule book that we all get that has the rules and the directory of legislators is called the Red Book because the cover is red. This year the cover will be metallic gold for 100, and we're getting pretty fancy there. But there'll be a lot of fun little things like that just to remind people. We wanted to get legislators the most cliche giveaway that you can get. When you're in the legislature, you get a lot of pens and chip clips and that kind of thing. So everyone's going to get a white coffee mug with the 100th session logo on it, because the last thing we need is another coffee mug, but we're going to get another one. So
that's Representative Tony Venhuizen, and you can explore more South Dakota history at his blog at SODAC Governors. That is our show for today. We hope that it served you. From all of us here at SDPB, I'm Lori Walsh. Thank you for listening.
Evacuation orders have been lifted in parts of LA as the city continues to battle wildfires. But for those with houses still standing, it's unclear if returning home is safe.
Part of our concern is making sure what we're coming back to is a place that's not just whole, but safe and stable for our family. Like, not every toxin is obvious.
That story on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Listen this afternoon, beginning at 3 Central, 2 Mountain on SDPB.
Donation centers pop up after disasters to assist those in need. Sometimes, though, too many donations, not enough help.
I've seen, pallets of clothing just left outside in a parking lot for months after some disasters.
I'm Kai Rizdal. The best way to donate next time on Marketplace.
Listen this evening at 6:30 Central, 5:30 Mountain on SDPB.